All right, everybody, welcome to the Otherppl Show. I'm Brad Listi, and I'm in Los Angeles. It's great to be with you. Happy Sunday. Hope everything's okay out there, wherever you happen to be. I have Donald Berger on the program today. He is a poet, and his most recent collection is entitled The Rose of Maine. It is available from SurVision Books. Donald Berger studied under James Tate at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and he was a contemporary of John Ashbery. They knew each other a bit, and we talk about that in the conversation ahead. He's one of our finer poets working today, and we had an excellent conversation. Very happy to have Donald Berger here on the program. That dialogue is coming up in just a couple of minutes. A quick reminder about my email newsletter. Don't forget to sign up over at Substack. It's bradlisti.substack.com. I will be in touch on a weekly basis to let you know about the latest episodes of this program. I also share a list of links to things that I've been reading and finding interesting. Also, I want to let you know about my new company. It is now live. It is called DeepDive, and it specializes in the creation of educational audio. The debut course from DeepDive is called How to Write a Novel. It features more than 50 hours of insight, inspiration, and instruction from nearly 46 of today's most celebrated contemporary authors, including Emily St. John Mandel, Steve Almond, Melissa Broder, Vivi Ganeshananthan, Juliet Escoria, Elle Nash, Kimberly King Parsons, Stephen Graham Jones, Todd Goldberg, Gina Frangelo, Madeline Lucas, Matthew Salisis, Wahini Vara. The list goes on. The launch for the company has been incredible. It's just a couple of weeks old, not even, as this episode airs, and I have been blown away by the enthusiasm, and I really appreciate it. A lot of it is coming, I think, from Otherppl listeners, so thank you very much. The course is currently on sale for 25% off. It's the big launch sale. So go get it over at www.deepdive.audio. You can stream the course online, or better yet, you can stream it on the DeepDive app right there on your phone, so you can listen wherever you go. It's very convenient and user-friendly. One more time, the website is www.deepdive.audio. Okay, so my guest once again is Donald Berger. His most recent poetry collection is called The Rose of Maine, and I thought it would be a good idea to have Don read a poem before we get started with the interview. So he read a poem of his called Uncle Sadness that I want to share with you right now. Uncle Sadness was recently anthologized in Best American Poetry of 2025. Here is Donald Berger reading Uncle Sadness.
I already to take a nap tomorrow is what it said on a person's sweatshirt in Hong Kong, where messages on shirts are plentiful. Uncle Sadness. That's the name of a poem I once wrote that I can't find, though maybe I will, but if not, I'll use it for this one. Meet at the Pandas, it says in my notes. Dragon Kiln, another title, potentially. Like a lonely pill cutter, oat standing, the figures on the Shiwan roof ridge drove me wild with happiness on the next to final day. The sun was trying to come out, not. Beauty farmers, skin rebuild, the escalator, a shock when I touched the belt. We're strong, said the fish. My ears are hurting. My ears are hurting so much. I'm not afraid of anything, I used to write. But now, I'm pretty sure I think. Do I have any hobbies? an old lady that went to Rutgers. I was like, if you see my timesheet, travel ready like a tailor at his wedding until we're handed off to the airport team. Preparing to opening, my card number is incomplete. My expiration date is incomplete. Please wait, still another title. Please wait, my lungs say, my heart. I go, my Mac will sleep soon. Snow over Utah and later in Idaho. If you look at my timesheet, a friend of Jesus, the name of the traitor has caused me to be forgotten by many. Can I write as fast as I can talk? Like telling Willie Mays to use his hands. I think about you. Where are you going right now? Where and when were you born? Where do you want to go that you have never been? White t-shirt, silver handgun, red hoodie. The victim ran from the corner west, knocked on a resident's door. That's rain, that's what you call it, you said to us in Georgetown. I'm without glasses, they say to me, and breathing into what is new. Taylor Branch is in my yoga class. 3 things I need to know. Harry Belafonte's story, Wave Books, Taylor Branch is in my yoga class. Let me bracket a bit and say, with psychological overwhelm, spring fair. The brain blocks out periods of time for us.
All right, that was Donald Berger reading his poem entitled Uncle Sadness. Donald Berger is the author, most recently, of a poetry collection called The Rose of Maine, which won the 2024 James Tate International Poetry Prize. His other books include Pizza Necklace, The Long Time, which was the winner of the Poetry Prize of the German Academy for Language and Poetry, and another book called Quality Hill, available from Lost Roads Publishers. Donald Berger's poems have appeared in journals in America, Europe, and Asia, and he currently teaches at Johns Hopkins University. I am so pleased to welcome him onto this program and to share our conversation with all of you right now. So let's get to it. Here I am with Donald Berger.
Well, actually, I was born in New York. I was born in Queens. My mother grew up in Queens, but then I moved to Long Island for a while and lived in, well, more than a while, probably 6-7 years. And then from Long Island, we moved up to Peabody, Massachusetts, so about 15 miles north of Boston. So I consider my true home, New England, in terms of the number of years I've lived there and who I identify with, and I'm a Red Sox fan and all that. But how did I get into this? Well, there was a time when my sister showed me these poems by a poet named Rod McEwen, who's really, really awful. But, I mean, he had titles of books like what was one called? I can't even remember it, but I was fascinated by the line breaks and just how it looked on the page. And then eventually came the Beats and Ginsberg and Richard Brautigan, but mostly Allen Ginsberg. My friend's older brother, who was kind of cool, he had a book, he had the Howl book on his dresser. And so I kind of got into poetry that way during I guess it would have been like even mid-70s, maybe around 70, maybe even early, I would say early 70s. And with a classmate or two, I started writing poems when I was a senior in high school. And classmates of mine were reading Buddhism and Buddhist texts, and they were reading Richard Brautigan and other people. He was publishing a lot of books. It seemed like they were coming out once a year. And they were published with a good press, and they were sold at City Lights and all over the place. It seemed like you were waiting for the next book. Again, I know what Rod McEwen's title was. It was Listen to the Warm.
And I got to say, Rod McEwen, I recently was reading about him. He was rich from selling his poetry.
Was he?
Yeah. He sold millions of copies of these books. I mean, for a time, he was kind of like a pop poet almost. Like,
yes, he definitely was. I don't know how he did it, but my sister had the books, and it was called Listen to the Warm. So I thought, that's interesting. In sixth grade, in sixth grade in Massachusetts, I won a prize for a poetry writing prize. It was a poem about hobbits, and it rhymed, and it was in four-line stanzas. And I think I won a collection of Robert Louis Stevenson's stories. But then it's amazing that you mentioned McEwen was so rich, and I believe it. And then came the Beats, and talking about Brodigan, looking back at him, he also is not strong. When I look back, I like this one book called Revenge of the Lawn, and maybe some of the fiction the prose is better, but I looked at a lot of the poetry, and I just didn't think it was really as strong as I would have guessed. But I still bought those books just to preserve him for myself in my library, and I've got them there now if I ever wanted to look at them. But so that senior year in high school, we were waiting for the next Brodigan book, and we thought we were like the Beats, and we were reading Ginsberg and other people, but mostly Ginsberg and whoever. But then I went to college, and so these two guys who were seniors in high school, we wrote poems together. And my friend, this is before college, just before, my friend sent a manuscript of ours named after a biology textbook called Dissection of the Cat and Other Selected Sheep Organs. That was the title of the book. And he sent it to Little Brown in Boston, like a very prestigious press. I think they thought it was cute that a high school student or two were writing a book of poems, and they wrote us the lengthiest rejection letter I've ever gotten, I think, which was about a half a page paragraph. He didn't tell me he was sending them, which was fun. It was still funny for me. But a teacher knew that we were trying to do this, and she said, you should try some creative writing in college. And so my first semester, I majored in something that had to do with global interests and ecology and whatever. And that wasn't really my field, but I was in it for one semester. And the second semester, I took a course in Intro to Creative Writing. The teacher was really good. It was fiction and poetry. And then I ended up in workshop 3 of them, I think, maybe, or a contemporary American poetry lit class with James Tate, who by then was kind of a rock star, and I'd heard a lot about him. When he was a graduate student at the University of Iowa in the MFA program, he won the Yale Series of Younger Poets Award, which is given to anybody under the age of 30, and he won it at the age of 20. And so he was still a graduate student, and it was kind of amazing that he did it. And then from there, we kind of gravitated toward him, and there were 4 or 5 of us who were poets, and he was the guru, really. He was the person we talked with, and he was very generous with his time. And when we gave reading at somebody's house, he even came to that. And he was a fantastic teacher. So that was really how I got launched with him. And then there was another wonderful teacher, David Lenson, who was in the comparative literature department, and he took us in and took us on, and he was submitting his own poems. He was giving us 3 credits every semester, independent study down the stretch, like our last year and a half. We'd taken so many classes with Tate that we moved on with David, and he first had them in the building where Complet was housed, and then at his house. So he was also a great teacher. So that's how I got started with all of it.
Okay, so I want to rewind a little bit to your
Yeah, sure.
like your childhood growing up in Peabody, Mass. And
Yeah.
it's always of interest to me how writers form, and if there's like any kind of like genetic lineage of creative writing or any kind of interest in the arts, or were there things that you think, like sometimes I feel like there could be events that conspire maybe with a genetic predisposition that cause a person to have like the temperament of a writer or a poet.
Yeah, I was at the University of Maryland. I was the administrative director of the MFA program there, and one of my colleagues, Michael Collier, invited me to his class. And somebody asked me how I got started, and at that age, at that time, my answer was, and this fits your question, the Columbia Record Club, which was a club that my parents joined. This was post-war. Early mid 50s. I was born in 56, where you spent $5 and you got 25 records. We always had records playing in our house. Crooners, Perry Como, Frank Sinatra, you name it, big band, Glenn Miller, what have you. And then they bought us Beatle, 45s and stuff later, but we had a lot of music in the house. My father sang around the house or while driving to himself. And then I think also I was a devout Catholic. I went to Catholic school for 10 years, and I was an altar boy. And I think the liturgy also, the poetic, biblical nature of the liturgy and being quote unquote spiritual certainly had something to do with it too. And then I think, so when I got to the point where I was reading Hermann Hesse, like Siddhartha and things like that, same time I was reading Ginsberg and all, I slid from Catholicism into a kind of high test, high octane spirituality with no God any longer there, but still feeling like I hadn't hit a really high bump, if that makes any sense.
Most of the poets I know have a kind of spiritual bent, and maybe in the work itself or trying to resolve questions or tensions. I was raised Catholic. I too was an altar boy for a time, not a very good one, but I remember like ringing those bells and
yeah, same with me. Right. We even wore white sneakers with our with our cassocks and everything. It was crazy.
But no weird priests. Like you didn't have any problems with the priests, hopefully.
No, I didn't. I was lucky.
Yeah, me too. So
yeah, good.
But I'm just curious, like when you kind of like slide away from Catholicism, like what age are you? And this kind of coincides with you becoming interested in poetry, it sounds like.
Yeah.
And I just like to hear you talk a little bit more about like that part of things.
Yeah, the other big part of it, Brad, was social stuff. I was writing with Paul Moriarty, and there was another guy, Dan Beauregard, who in high school we had a modular schedule so we could leave. We had big free periods and we couldn't leave campus, but we did. And we walked like 4 blocks down the road to a candlepin bowling alley. And that's where we hung out and shared poems and talked about stuff. So that, but then particularly in college, I can remember one time walking from, I think it was called South Hall or something, the Comp Lit building where David Lenson had the workshop. And I was walking with 3 or 4 of my friends, or there were 4 of us walking home off the campus. And I thought to myself, I wouldn't want to be doing anything else. This is such a wonderful thing with these people. So showing each other work and that whole phenomenon still to this day is one of the biggest things. It doesn't have to do so much, though it sometimes has to do with wanting your poems to last, wanting to get published. Maybe I wouldn't even use the word fame, but whatever happens in that way. But so much of it was just the pleasure of writing and knowing we had known a couple of these teachers, these people who we were working with. And then in graduate school, and then as it goes on, it snowballs, and you know this person and that person, and they like your work. So it's this whole field but I still communicate with people from back in college. I still talk to them, and I still show them my work, or people who knew people I went to college with. So there's that. Even today, I will send out a couple of poems I'm going up the street to read. There'll be friends of mine reading. They're sitting there in the audience. So there's that part of it too, is the social scene.
That's interesting. Because I don't know if I've heard that before, that the social aspect of poetry, and maybe like there's a kind of heightened level of intimacy when you're exchanging work with people, and they're kind of right? I mean, they're putting their best selves down on the page, or their deepest selves down on the page. And so it kind of strips away some of the superficiality of like a more ordinary human exchange.
Yeah. And also I think we were imagining that we wanted our stuff to be as good as possible because we were used to this workshop phenomenon. Kenneth Koch once said, New York poet, that when we were younger, we were just out of college, we were showing each other work. We were a team like the Minnesota Vikings. And he might have even said we loved each other's work, whatever he wrote. He might have said that, but Ashbery said to me, that certainly wasn't what it was like for me, and he was in that group. But so it was partly like maybe a little competitive. And in college, there weren't even really any readings. There was only one reading that I can remember doing. And Tate was there. It was somebody's apartment. Tate was there, Paul Mariani, who wrote the Williams biography, the authoritative William Carlos Williams biography. They both came. He was one of our teachers too in literature. So there really weren't readings then. And even in graduate school, there weren't any readings, but it was just that more readings have happened later in my life, more and more since I was, I don't know, maybe like in my 30s on, when I was a teacher. First in private schools, and then later in college. When I was teaching at colleges, universities.
So you talk about these college days and the sort of beginnings of your career as a poet. You were at Amherst in Massachusetts.
I was at the University of Massachusetts. That's where Tate was, and there were people coming from the other colleges to work with him. There was a guy from Amherst College who I remember being with, and maybe a couple of them, maybe somebody one time from Smith, or there was somebody I knew who certainly knew who he was. I think Richard Wilbur was teaching at Smith. Very different scene from Tate's, a very different poet from Tate's. So,
what did your parents think of this? You tell your parents you're going to become a poet. What do they say to you?
Yeah, that's good. I think they were probably happy that I was happy with it. I was in a play once too. I adapted a Chekhov short story called Ward Number 6, and when they came to see that my junior year, I think they were a little spooked by that because it was about a doctor who was going in to treat a patient, but he was losing his mind himself, and I played the doctor. So it was kind of graphic and extreme. So I think it scared my mother, maybe my father, and maybe they were wondering who these poets were. But at the same time, I would tell them about my writing, I'd tell them about my teachers, and I think they were happy, and I think they ended up being happy that I was with a group who, and I was writing this stuff, and I graduated. I had this interest in literature. It was funny because one time at Christmas, my father gave me, and I still have the book, a little dime store paperback shaped book that you might see on an old stand in a drugstore, is Robert Frost's poems. And my father gave it to me for Christmas. And my wife, I'm getting all these Freudian slips worked in here. My father gave it to me for Christmas, and my mother said to him, "Oh, Bill, that's not the kind of poetry he really reads." And I said, "Of course it is. It actually is." Like Tate loved the poem Directive, and he was the one who quoted it at one point, or somebody else, one of my teachers named Joseph Langland, had quoted it at someone's MFA defense. And so Tate with us in the bookseller's house in Amherst quoted it, and he told us we should read that poem. So there were certain people like Whitman, Frost, who reappeared in college, the Bible, who reappeared in college, where you'd say, oh, people are reading that here, that's going to work here. And in the opposite way, Carl Sandburg never came up, but we read him in the English classes in high school. So there was something, interesting about that. So, the other thing was in Amherst, there was a bookstore named Logos, and Bill Heinzelman was the seller, and Tate used to hang out in there too. And we got to know Bill. So that was all a really nice scene, especially for an undergrad,
Well, and I feel like too, listening to you talk, obviously you got a good education. The high school that you kind of launched out of on your way to college sounded like a really good high school. Like kids were reading about Buddhism and reading the Beats and.
Well, yeah, they were reading all that on their own. Like when I got into high school, when I got into senior year of high school, I wasn't involved in sports anymore. I was an athlete for the first 3 years for parts of up and through the end of the third year, excuse me. The last year was carte blanche. I didn't really know. I started smoking cigarettes, which I've since quit, but I was smoking cigarettes and I was hanging out with these. There were two girls in particular, young women, who were reading all this Buddhism stuff, Alan Watts and whatever. So like, who are they reading? What are they reading? And they became part of our group, or really spearheaded the reading of that stuff. So that wasn't all assigned, but we were listening to Bob Dylan, and I was enjoying reading Shakespeare, and I liked my English classes the most, I think, of anything. So they were interested, and they knew we were writing this stuff. And so one of the teachers, even one of my English teachers, said, when you get to college, you should keep on doing this. And so I did. I wanted to be a philosophy major, but logic right away kind of scared me and discouraged me. I never went that far with it. So by sophomore year, it was English. But it was a pretty good school in that, academically, in a perfect world, if I wanted the very best education, I might have gone down the street to St. John's Prep, which was all male. But my parents, it was just sort of a natural shift from the elementary school where we were taught by Polish Franciscan nuns just down the street in Peabody to the next place, which was the high school. That was the path that a lot of people took to Bishop Fenwick. That was the name of the high school. Yeah.
What about the Transcendentalists? Like for a guy who grew up in Mass, like not far from Boston, did they figure into your?
Yeah, we had this wonderful American Civilization or American Studies class that was English and history combined, and they took us to Walden Pond, and we read, parts of Walden. I had a poster on my wall that had the Thoreau quote about a beat of a different drummer. Then I also had a Ferlinghetti poster and stuff. So I was lucky being up there that I took a field trip to Walden Pond, and they were liberal minded and they had their heads in the right places, the teachers. So the only thing that they didn't do was they didn't teach very much writing, like essays. Or we didn't write any poems in our classes, really. They didn't teach much essay writing, not nearly as much as I taught when I was a high school, like middle school and high school teacher at all, So, but it was a good school.
I have great affection for the Transcendentalists and the Beats. I recently I was tweeting something or blue skying. I don't even know what you call it, but I was writing something online about how the Transcendentalists and the Beats, I can see a lineage between the two. And I think that the Beats, I have a feeling that work, like hundreds of years from now, if humanity is still a thing, I could imagine that those literary movements would maybe have staying power. And my assessment of the Beats in particular is that the work is really uneven. It can be a mess.
Oh, yeah, sure. No question. Even Ginsberg is uneven.
Yeah.
Himself, just his work. Oh, yeah.
At its best, it's really good. And I think its core interests are really on target. Like the way that cohort was responding to, I mean, they were really at the vanguard of like poets who were working in a world that was suddenly nuclear, where like a nuclear holocaust was a real possibility. And I think they were reacting against that, at humanity's capacity for self-destruction and for, and they were also reacting against just like hyper-militarism and hyper-capitalism and modern American kind of craziness. And I'm wondering, I mean, it sounds like that's your assessment as well.
Well, William Manchester wrote this book. I think it's called The Story of the Dream. No, The Glory of the Dream. Great social history, taking us from like the 40s up through the 30s, 40s up through the 70s. And when he gets to the beats, and this is an academic writing social history, he really hoists the beats into this very, favorable light as a social phenomenon. And he talks about them in a social way. Now, if you go back and read, I agree with you. If we think of which writers really had poetry, were strong poets, there's a couple of poems by Corso I can remember. There are poems by Ginsberg, of course. And I got to actually hear him read Howl once. I was kind of stunned by it. I didn't expect it at the third event I ever heard him at. But I could see how historically there would be that connection. I would like to read more of Emerson, and I've read some of his essays, but I'd like to read more because I read that recently. I was reading Song to Myself again, Whitman, and I was wondering who influenced this, where the influences come from. And I went back and read Robert Haas's introduction to this one edition. And he said there were biblical references like, Ezekiel and Isaiah and so on. But he was really, so involved with Emerson's essays. And he actually took he excerpted from a letter that Emerson had written him and used it as an intro to the book, to his poems. And I don't think Emerson knew that he was going to do that, and I don't think Emerson was that happy about it. But yeah, I used to go to Concord all the time and see where Emerson lived. I saw his grave and Thoreau's grave and all that. So.
Yeah, and I think like when you think about the Beats in relationship to the Transcendentalists, and this thing that you were saying about the Beats and their social impact, I can't help but point to like the ways in which both the Transcendentalists and the Beats brought together East and West in their work and in their kind of worldview in a way that I think we're still feeling the repercussions of. Like if we can agree that the work of the Beats is uneven and can be kind of messy, we have to at the same time give them credit for really changing the culture. Like the social impact of it's still here. I mean, you can feel it in all different aspects of the culture. And
yeah, it started then. Yeah.
And I mean, I guess occasionally there will be an effort made to like create like a new movement in literature and give it a name, but it's not common. Like it doesn't happen all that often, that like a group of people like form a team and they get a name and it kind of sticks and becomes a thing.
Yeah. The language poets were one group, which there's more the plasticity of the language, the sound of the language, the sort of Marxist origins. The self is as less a concern, though language poets embrace people who are clear and logical also, but you'll see things that are often pure sound. You'll hear things that are often pure sound. As the Beats, another thing that was interesting about them was that you had to consider who was on the West Coast, like Robert Duncan and, Jack Spicer, and Brodigan was sort of off on his own, but Jack Spicer, Robert Duncan, a lot of people living there who the Beats knew. And, when Ginsberg was reading Howl, which he read for the first time in San Francisco, I'm sure that there were some of those poets in the room or heard about it. So I don't know if all of those people would have even been grouped with the beats, though they're thought of as, they're traveling, they're bouncing back and forth between the East and West Coast. So the other thing about spirituality and transcendentalism was in my class, this American Studies class that I was in high school. I was complaining I took this business course and it just was not interesting and I wanted to drop it. And I was worried about the credits. And the hip former teacher of the American Studies class said to me, well, Don, you might just have to transcend here, and I knew what it meant, from that era.
So you mentioned earlier in our conversation, John Ashbery in passing. Yeah. It sounds like you knew him.
Yeah, I knew him through my friend Martin Earl, a phenomenal poet who I shared. He was a friend of my girlfriend in college, in the middle years of college, and he ended up living in a house with us. And he was studying like middle English or Old English, and he was taking Chinese and, I think it was Chinese, doing the characters and all this. But he would come into my room and he'd say, what are you doing? I'd say, I'm writing poetry. And then he was really, really smart and he started writing. And then other people joined us in workshops. So he ended up going to Brooklyn College for his MFA. And I ended up going to the University of Washington in Seattle, which only had an MA, I discovered later when I moved there. But, I got it. But Martin ended up getting to know John very well and even he was his student, but then he became his secretary and his good friend. So through him, I met him, and then on a number of occasions was with him for long stretches of time. Like if he was in a certain place, like when he was in Berlin, I went to when he was at the American Academy there, I went to a reading, and then August Kleinsaler was there too, who knew John. And then we offered to take him to Leipzig with his partner, David. And so we drove him to Leipzig, and then we had him over for dinner, in Berlin. And then another time I brought him to Maryland, and he came for 2 days. We paid him through this lecture series, and he came for dinner at my house then. And then when they came to Georgetown later, and they were in town, they called me. So he wanted to know somebody. When he called and he was in Washington, he would contact me. And I spent enough, stretches of time with him to get to know him, pretty well. So we definitely were friendly, and I got to a point where I was very comfortable with him. And, he liked small talk, and he, there's a funny story where I didn't know him so well, but Martin was inviting me to dinner at his house, and John was going to be there with his former partner from France, Pierre Martori. John spent, 8-10 years in Paris and left France when his mother died. John came back to the States, and Pierre stayed there. But Pierre was going to be at Martin's house, and I'm driving down. John had blurbed one of my books, and I'm coming down the highway to go to Martin's, and I'm saying, what the hell am I going to talk about here with these guys? And I was really nervous. I walk in, I said, I'm not going to talk about the traffic coming down. And I walk in and I sit across Martin's living room with Martin before we eat this wonderful lobster soup that John made. And he says to me, it's just he and I in the living room. And he says to me, so how is the traffic coming down? So from there on, from that time on, over time, I felt like I saw him, I loved his work, but I saw him easily as a person, and, in cars and in my house and elsewhere, at readings and stuff, where I introduced him a couple of times, once at the Folger Library in Washington, and once at the University of Maryland. So it was I knew his work quite well before I met him. Martin and I made a soup for him in his house in New York. Tate I heard about, and I knew I was going to take a class with him down the line, and I was addicted to the book called Absences, which is now falling apart, and the cover on it is faded. And I still read those poems, and I don't think there's a collected that it's in, so I still read it. And if that talk about liturgy, that you would, if we had a book like that, you know what it's like, the sound of the whatever. Did you use the Latin in your altar boy stuff?
Not that I can recall.
I didn't. I did use the Latin in the Polish with the Polish nuns, but hearing his poems again when I read Absences, that stuff sticks in my head, and I realized that I remembered not whole poem, total top to bottom. I had not memorized too many poems in it, but all of those lines are still in my head. So that was a big deal. And Brad, it's interesting when you talked about someday there'll be more study of the transcendentalist influence on the beats. Ashbery and Tate were good friends. And as they went on, if you looked at 3 or 4 or 5 of their books, their work was parallel. One's work sounded like another's. And I mentioned that to Ashbery once when I was introducing him at the Folger. And I told my friend Eli Gottlieb, was a fiction writer, but he was in the group with us in Amherst. A couple of people were from Hampshire College, Eli Gottlieb and Peter Cole, who's a translator and poet, and a MacArthur Fellow, actually. I told Eli and a bunch of people that I'd said to John, oh, yeah, well, your work, this sounds so much like Tate. And, John just kind of chuckled. But, I think Eli turned to his girlfriend or something and said, Don told the greatest poet in the English language that he was, his work was influenced by, his teacher or something like that. He thought it was like sort of sacrilegious. But John was kind of chuckling. And they really did. If you look, they were clearly showing each other work. And they wrote for a while together what I would call Baroque narratives, or Tate did, where they were really ratcheted up stories, but they had linguistically and sonically, they were really torqued up. And I don't think John ever did that to that extent, but they overlap, definitely. And I remember telling my friend Ed Barrett which books they were. So anyway, that was really that was kind of an interesting thing. And right down, through to the end of their lives, they were really close. So,
well, it makes sense that two like heavyweight poets who were contemporaries and friends would kind of measure each other.
Yeah, and they were both francophones. We were reading more French stuff initially than we were reading like typical traditional British stuff, maybe to a fault. But when Jim would mention, Baudelaire's biography, we ran and went and read it. And Ashbery certainly was a francophone. Neither one was linear in their writing. They had what somebody might call surrealistic influences, certainly. And they also didn't live very far from each other, because John lived in New York and then up in Hudson on the Hudson River, and Jim lived in Western Mass. So that was only like a 2-hour drive too. So, and then I just got to know other poets just through graduate school, being in Providence. I got to know Forrest Gander and C.D. Wright, who published my first book. Other poets who came through there, the Waldrops, Keith and Rosemary Waldrop had their press Burning Deck. Allison Bundy, who published with Burning Deck, prose fiction writer. Robert Coover, John Hawkes taught there. And then I moved to Maryland and I got a job. Then I moved into Boston and I went to different readings there, and I saw Ed Barrett again. Then I went to Maryland and started working at the University of Maryland. So all of it snowballed, and I just kept meeting more and more poets as I got older. I was lucky.
And you've lived all over the world, I hear. Right? You've been in Berlin and you've been in Hong Kong.
Yeah. So when my wife and I were, when I was about 30, we went to Germany. My wife is a neuroscientist who studies the auditory system of the bat. And she now teaches at Hopkins. She had a lab at the University of Maryland also, and at Harvard, where she was a junior faculty member. And I had a Fulbright to teach as a foreign language assistant in what was called a gymnasium, which is like first grade to 13th grade, or third grade to 13th grade. They made the cut of university bound versus, other things much earlier, much younger. But then they also had like their institutes and educational institutions that were for like government or things like that, might not necessarily be in the university. And so people, or it was vocations too, whatever people did. But I taught at the gymnasium. So we were there for a year, then we stayed for a second year. And then when I came back, I was back in Providence. And then twice when we lived in Maryland, and I was teaching, but I was mainly helping run the MFA program in Maryland. We took our kids to Berlin twice for a year each. And we took our whole family. We took all three kids each time, separated by about 8 years. And then my daughter, about 8 years ago, moved to Hong Kong. She just had our first grandchild.
Oh, congratulations.
I'd show you a picture if you were near her. But she about her fifth, fifth year there, we went and lived in Hong Kong for a year. And I met poets there. Like Forrest told me people to look up. And then I looked up one who was a translator mostly of Mandarin. And then I met 5 others or 6 others. And the scene in Hong Kong was active, but there really were about 10 core people. If you got to know them, even within a year, the readings that I did there were so much fun. And there was really like the greatest literary discovery of anybody might have been, there were a few different people. I remember meeting James Shea, who published 2 books with a press called Fence, and just other people I knew and published in their magazines and so on. And it was really, really exciting to be with them. Chris Song was there, and other people. So it was just wonderful to meet with them. And then 9 months after we were there, 9 months, almost 10 months in Hong Kong. And then we went back to Tübingen in Germany for 3 months. That was quite a transition just to close out the year. And that was also the hometown of the great, he's not widely read in the United States, but his name is Friedrich Hölderlin, or in English, it would look like Holderlin, but it's pronounced Hölderlin. And he was a great German romantic poet who basically, became unable to write anymore and was really disabled psychologically, and this carpenter put him up for most of his adult life in a turret in his house that was right on the Neckar River. So it's this symbolic place, Hölderlin's Turm, Hölderlin's Tower. And people come to Tübingen to see this golden turret, right on the Neckar, this is in southwest Germany. So yeah, I've lived in those places, and I learned German. And then I published a book actually in German with the help of a guy. The second time I was in Berlin, I met a good friend named Christoph Koenig, who's a scholar and does most of his work on Rilke. And he translated one of my books. So it was published with a really big German press and sold here also, though I purchased the books and would bring them to readings and so on. So, and I went back there in January and gave some readings there too. So that was a big thing.
It's interesting to hear you talk about all of these cities around the world and kind of integrating yourself into the scene. And it feels like the literary scene in just about any city except maybe New York, like it's not that hard to meet the people. There's usually not that many people. I would imagine it's even more the case with poetry. Like the poetry scene in any given city around the world, there are probably like 10 people at the core of it who are kind of making it run. And if you show up at the book, if you show up at the readings and you show up at the bookstores and you say hi, it's a friendly crowd. You're probably going to get to know the scene relatively quickly.
Yeah. And I really don't know what it's like in New York, but that's a good, distinction to make. It's probably a little more imposing. I don't know what San Francisco's like, but or Los Angeles, or Chicago for that matter. But I think because I haven't lived there, but I think like with Joey's reading series,
Joey Grantham.
Joey Grantham, with his reading series with his friend, his partner, Ashley Bryant Phillips, a fiction writer, they drew amazing crowds, and people are still, missing it. They moved in August, so the last reading there was at a place called Fadenzonen, which is a word that the German poet Paul Celan invented. You'd go to those readings and you'd meet a lot of people, and there are a lot of writers in Baltimore. They come from different places, a lot of them fiction, a lot of them poetry. I don't know the numbers, but they would be out there, and there's a bar there, and the room was always packed. You had to kind of fight your way in. And the Hopkins readings, in comparison, are largely attended by the students in the MFA program. And there's a good lineup of poets and fiction writers there, too, limited to maybe 4 or 5 fiction, 4 or 5 poetry. So there, it's countable, too. I think for me, it might happen like in a case like New York, where you might meet one person. So you meet John or Ashbury, or you meet Martin, and then Martin's friends. Ben Sloan edited a magazine called Mothers of Mud. So, my friend Terrence Winch, who I met later in my time in DC, a terrific poet, who's actually just edited the last, Best American Poetry 2025 is going to be the last of that series. He just edited that, and that's the manuscript. That's the book that Uncle Sadness is in. He, I met him, and he remembers people from New York because he's from the Bronx, and he would connect between DC and New York. He remembered people whose names I was bringing up, who I knew, like Ben Sloan or Jerome Sala or somebody, these poets who he had crossed paths with. There was some kind of a close connection there between him and those people. So I had a mini scene of John, who was at the top of the mountain, and then these younger people who were like Ed Barrett, Martin Earl, all these people doing these other webzines, not webzines, but magazines. And New York might take a little bit longer. I don't know if it would be a geographical thing, like you had the Beats who were, they were in one place, and then they were downtown maybe, and the New York school was considered in Midtown, and then maybe then Black Mountain was North Carolina, but that was Creeley and Charles Olson and other people, and so and Robert Duncan went there too. So I'm pretty sure he did. So anyway.
Well, I want to shift gears before we close, and I want to ask you about process. I think it's a fascination to my listeners how writers make their work, and I think poets, there are certainly some common denominators, but everybody kind of comes at it in different ways. I have good sourcing. Joey Grantham tells me that you always keep a notebook in your front shirt pocket.
Yeah.
I would imagine that's part of your process, but can you just talk about how poems happen for you and how you do the work?
Yeah. So I always give my students advice, keep a small notebook in your pocket, like, mine's right here. And then the other thing is write every day. That's what Tate used to say, it's write every day, because you'll get as good as you want to be if you write every day. And he used to lie, and he told me that he lied and said 6 hours a day. But what he meant was to be at your table for a certain number of hours a day, maybe listening to music, writing, whatever. I try to do that, but Tate asked me once, can you write with a notebook? And I said, I can. And I mean like one of those Marvel 8x11 notebooks. I can sit in places and write that by hand. I can sit at my desk for like 4 hours listening and writing on the computer. And I can write while traveling, though Tate, he had wonderful advice for us in different ways. He said to us, when you travel, don't worry about writing the perfect Hong Kong poem, because that will come later. Now, my problem is that it won't come later for me as I get older, because I won't remember everything. But like when I went to Hong Kong, my friend at Hopkins, Andrew Miller, he was at a reading I gave, and he said, I really like the short poems. And I was going to Hong Kong, so I said, that's what I'm going to write. I'm going to write a book of short poems. So what I end up doing, basically, I think, Brad, is I'm sometimes lucky, and I find it started out that I wrote, and then I revised, and I was in a kind of workshop, improve it thing, which I've continued on forever, revise more. I write way too much, so I have stuff in the house, and I have poems upstairs I can hear crying to be let out of. It's not hoarding where I can't move through the house, but there are certain boxes here and there that I discover with, a little pile like this, like maybe a foot high, 6 inches high, that I have to attend to. Those I might go back through and change again a little bit and then try to index. But somebody smiled, Nate Brown smiled a couple of years ago and said, sounds like you need an intern. I guess in the English department at Hopkins, you can get somebody to be your intern to come in and help you try to do that. But I also started writing epistles. So I go on email from the time when I lived in Maryland. I go on email and I start writing to someone, Dear Eli. He's the one I started it with. And then I write in verse. And when I'm done, I press send, and he reads it, and I would stand around the house and do the dishes, expecting like an hour or two later for him to tell me whether he liked it or not. So I have those, which I collect, and then I revise them as I see fit. If something's really terrible, I'll probably throw it out, but I keep a lot of stuff. And currently what I'm doing is I'm writing epistles, I'm writing new poems, and they're often written with someone in mind, like in this Donald Allen anthology, The New American Poetry. There was an anthology war between Robert Peck, who did in 61, 62, did the traditional, and Robert Allen did the experimental. Frank O'Hara said, I just invented the school that I'm in, and that's called personism. It means that it's what you're doing when you're talking on the phone to someone else. And I was writing like skittery poems that didn't make much sense, and I was getting criticized for them. And it probably rightly so. And even Tate at one point said to me, you should maybe try writing narrative. He said to me when he picked me up hitchhiking, he was driving into the campus, so I went with him, and he said, maybe try some narrative while he's trying to maybe straighten my back. But I think I just write ideally for hours a day, it might be 4 hours, including reading, it might be like 3-4 hours on a given day, and I try to write every day, and I pull stuff out of folders and revise. So it's writing things. And then what I often did was I stockpiled manuscripts where I wrote a book, like in Maryland about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I walked past a tree and it had a proscenium arch at the bottom of it with a brick inside it. And that looked like a stage. So on my way to work, I would put something on the brick. And then I'd record what I put in and how it changed every day. Like if the squirrel took the mint off of the brick, or if something else was left. And I wrote a book called The Story of the Tree. Other times I just go and I find the best poems that I have. Like I published a book called The Long Time, which my friend from Germany translated. And he said to me, Forrest Gander and C.D. Wright published my first book. That was like 2 manuscripts. And Forrest said, do you mind if I fuse them? And I said, great, you'll go ahead. Christoph Koenig said, give me 50 pages, give me 50 poems. I went and tried to find the best poems I could. That was more of a selected. And then other times I would just write books with titles and table of contents, and I would send it through email in an attachment to 3 or 4 friends. So it was sort of published in a way, but that's kind of dangerous because you think they like it, and if they like it, and Ed Barrett says, no, don't change a word, it's done, then you wouldn't send it out. So Eli said to me, you really have to make it, your part of your process to send out more. So that's what I've been doing more and more of as I get on, like in the last 15 years, 20 years. Like before that, maybe somebody solicited a manuscript, or I might have had some good luck and sent to I sent to Fence once, and they took the poem. Maybe the editor of a magazine asked me for a poem, something like that. So it's largely writing in the notebooks or online, revising to something that I think I like, that I could imagine a human being saying, and then hoping that other people like it also. So I don't know if that answers your question or you want to follow up.
No,
maybe I evaded the question.
No, I think that's it. It's just like sometimes I think people begin with an image, or they're picking up lines from like a conversation, whether they're involved in the conversation.
Oh yeah, definitely. John Hawkes in Providence at Brown, when Robert Creeley read, he said, Bob, how do you do this? And Creeley said, well, you start with the first line. And I do start often with the first line of anything. That's really what happens. Or there may be a theme, or there may be a book I'm looking at, or I look in my notebook and I start to kind of collage. So I look at that marble notebook and I take the best lines and I try to weld them together into something that sounds like it's speech. Like I could imagine somebody giving a kind of dramatic monologue, really. In Uncle Sadness, that was the case, where it was kind of jumping from stanza to stanza, but I imagine that the person's thought was changing, maybe stanza to stanza. So, but then I remember Tate saying narrative, and I remember his idea of writing as much as you can every day really stuck. So, and then Simic and another teacher said, if you write 15 minutes a day, this is when I was teaching like 4 classes, 4 preps at a private school in Boston, and I had 2 kids, or I had 3 kids in Massachusetts, in Maryland. Then I was trying to write every day if I could, and I always had that idea. Ideally, I want to try to do the 4 hours, but if I can't, I stay with it and I write something. So that's how it goes.
All right. Well, it's been a real pleasure to meet you and to talk with you. How do we close this out? Like we talked about having an opening line, and that's where you begin. What's the closing line of this conversation? I will give you the floor.
I'll close with a first line of a poem by Ashbery. Well, I want to thank you first, Brad. This has been wonderful. And then maybe I can close with just the first line of a poem by Ashbery, which is of a poem. Is anything central?
There we go. We'll leave listeners lingering with that question. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Brad. Really appreciate it.
Okay, folks, there we have it. That was my conversation with Donald Berger. His most recent poetry collection is called The Rose of Maine. It is available from SurVision Books. I do not believe there is an official website or a social media presence, so read the poetry. Again, that most recent collection is called The Rose of Maine. Go get it. Don't forget to subscribe to this show wherever you listen. Hit the subscribe button. You can also subscribe on YouTube, and you can follow me on social media. I'm on Blue Sky and Instagram. Sign up for my weekly email newsletter over at bradlisti.substack.com. And if you love this program, if you listen regularly, please support the show over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. If you want to get a book club subscription or get an Otherppl t-shirt, you can do all of that stuff over at the show's official website, otherppl.com. Be sure to check out DeepDive, my new company, and its debut course, How to Write a Novel. More than 50 hours of never-before-heard insight, inspiration, and instruction from dozens of today's leading contemporary authors. Check it out, www.deepdive.audio. And if you have 2 minutes and you want to do me a favor, please give this show a rating wherever you listen. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, what have you. Rate it, review it. It helps the show find new listeners. All right, so I'll be back in a couple of days on Tuesday with a new episode. I'm not going to tell you who the guest is because I don't have it on tape yet, but rest assured, it's going to happen. Have faith. A new episode of Otherppl, hopefully, coming up on Tuesday. Stay tuned.